Our New Testament lesson is from Luke 20, verse 45 through 47, and then Luke 21, 1 through 6. While all the people were listening, Jesus said to his disciples, "Beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes, and they love to be greeted in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses, and for a show they make lengthy prayers. Such men will be punished most severely." And looking in chapter 21, verse 1. As he looked up, Jesus saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. "I tell you the truth," he said, "this poor widow has put in more than all the others. All these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on." Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down." This is the word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Deacon, and thank you, Edith and Patty. It was great. Sometimes when things like this happen, if we don't have the organ or whatnot, when we go to the piano, it's nice because those are the moments sometimes that we have where we hear each other sing. And I think sometimes, every once in a while, we need that. We need to hear each other sing, and we need to hear the singing community. And I'm just thankful that we have such gifts in our community that we can lean on. As Michael has mentioned, Judith was out today, and we will miss her and continue to pray for her. So we're thankful for our robust music ministry with all of their gifts. I think we need to spend some time with Jesus today. I heard he's over at the temple people watching. Now, if you're hesitant like I am, I'm not surprised. Just earlier this week, Jesus came to Jerusalem, and there were disciples out there waving palm branches, saying, "Hosanna, he who comes in the name of the Lord," and everyone was praising. But then things started to turn south. Jesus came to the temple, and rather than being the passive comforter that we sometimes know him to be, Jesus took on the mantle of his prophetic leadership and started to throw out the moneylenders. He overturned tables, he made a whip of cords, and pushed out all of the livestock, threw everyone's coins all over the place, saying, "This is my Father's house, a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of thieves." So if you're hesitant like me to spend some time with Jesus today in the temple, I'm not surprised, because ever since then, all of the leaders and the religious authorities have been looking for a way to kill Jesus and get rid of him once and for all. And they were trying to scheme and conspire, trying to figure out ways to trap him, but the people were on his side, and there was not much that they could do. You see, they knew they were in hot water. When Jesus came into the temple and started overthrowing all the tables, he placed himself within that long history that the religious teachers and the scholars and the scribes would have known. Because all the way back, about 700 years from the book of Amos, when God set out God's prophets in order to indict the people of Israel, especially the leaders and those who led worship, against the oppressive injustices that they were multiplying in their midst. You see, it was the religious leaders back in the day of Amos and Hosea and Malachi who started to grab land at the peril of the people. Things got so bad they forgot about God's law and forgot about the Sabbath. They forgot the meaning of worship. And rather than turning to God and trusting God and being God's people, they turned their backs on the law. Started to gain things for themselves at the expense of the people. And as the poor grew poor, divorce rates were going up. Other people, in order to try to make ends meet, were starting to marry people of other nations. People forgot about the Sabbath. Even the priests and the Levites were so poor that they had to go back to work. They couldn't lead people in worship. Things got out of order. So when Jesus came to the temple and declared that the people there were making his father's house a den of thieves, he was only echoing those prophets of old. It was in Zechariah and Malachi and Jeremiah and even in portions of Isaiah where we see this language in which God declares and indicts the religious leaders against turning a profit, against trying to advocate for the people. The den of thieves, and that language of an indictment against the very people who are supposed to lead people in worship goes back all the way to that prophetic history. And here Jesus is again picking on the scribes and the religious leaders for devouring the houses of widows and turning worship into something that God never intended it to be. He came not as that gentle, compassionate person in this last week of his life, but rather, just as Malachi said, the messenger of God would come into the temple as a refiner's fire and a launderer's soap. So here we have Jesus people watching today, and we can see that he is taking note of all of the splendor around him. First, he notices the clerics and the clergy and the scribes with their long robes, and they're trying to vie for the best seats in the house and trying to go to their dinner parties and getting places of honor. You see, you have to remember, this is Passover week, after all. It is a holy week to the Jews, and the population of Jerusalem swells during this Passover week. And there are some in their midst who treat this Passover week like it's a movie premiere. You've watched TV, you know what I'm talking about. The people who have these long red carpets and they come out in their nice dresses and take pictures in the camera and they go to their balls and all of these fancy feasts. And the life during Jerusalem at this time was kind of like that. You can get the picture that the priests are coming in with their long robes and the red carpets and they're going to their dinner parties and they're looking at Facebook to see how many likes they got in their selfies. And they're also taking note of the people who didn't like them, and they'll remember that for later. And Jesus gives the same indictment that the prophets before him gave. That rather than worship God, they're going into this long show, giving these big dinner parties where they're fighting for seats. And he's there people watching. Then his disciples notice the beautiful buildings. It's not just the splendor of the clerks, but the beautiful buildings. This great temple of Herod with all of its inscriptions and beautiful ornamentation. And Jesus says to them, don't trust them. Not one stone will be left upon another. And by the way, those clerics, they'll have a greater condemnation, so beware of those on the red carpet. And Jesus gives a warning to his disciples that they shouldn't be blinded by the glitz and glitter, or the privilege, or the things that people put around themselves in order to make believe that they have it all together. Even the fortifications of the strong walls of the temple are just as fragile as a house of cards. And as Jesus is sitting there, people watching, and we join with him, and sit around and watch the crowds, Jesus leans forward in his seat, for something catches his eye. He gathers in his closest disciples and he says, look at this, take a look at this. And there, in the midst of all of this clamor, comes one of those poor widows whose houses were once devoured by the leadership. And the poor widow walks up to one of the offering baskets in the temple, reaches deep into her thin pockets, and in her frailty give what Scripture calls two lepta, 2 coins, lepta being the Greek for thin ones, for they are the thinnest, smallest coins that anyone can own. And there Jesus witnesses a miracle as she gives out of her poverty, the last of what she has to live on, in total trust to God. See, Jesus gathers his disciples and says, take a look at this, disciple. Take a look at this. Look, for there are many who give out of their generosity and out of their abundance, but she gives out of her scarcity. She gives all that she has, and in that she has given more. And we learn by people watching with Jesus the kind of vision that God has for the world today. Jesus sees something that we might not notice, and what catches Jesus' eye may not be what catches our eyes. And Jesus realigns our vision from the beautiful things around us to the vulnerability and brokenness where we find Christ in the midst of that place of poverty. So many give out of their abundance, but it is the widow who gives all of what she has. And Jesus turns things on his head by reminding us that those who seem to have it all together, those who give out of their abundance, are safe to give and give out of a place of security and strength. But even then, they are trapped because the more we have, the more we worry, the more we build up, the more fortifications we need, the more we surround ourselves with things, the more we have to try in order to keep them and to sustain them. And he notices with his vision of those divine eyes, this widow who has nothing to lose and therefore has everything to offer, who isn't in the midst of the trappings of all she owns, but rather knows a life of want and therefore has nothing to lose by giving all that she has. Charity lost her home. Charity lost her loved one. What more can there be to give but her whole self? And as Jesus looks around at those beautiful edifices, as Jesus looks around about the people who have honor and pretend like they know what they're doing, he sees in that brokenness the fact that true trust in God comes not out of our strength, but out of our weakness. Not the things we know how to do, not the many ways we plan, but usually in that last 10% of faith where we are called to step out and fully trust in God. Not out of our abundance, but rather out of our scarcity, out of our vulnerability. So Jesus looks at all of these things, and what catches his eye in our life is where we are most vulnerable, and measures our faith by how we live out of our brokenness and our vulnerability, rather than by the many things we surround ourselves with that give us the illusion that we have it all together. You know as well as I do, going that last 10% is the hardest. We had a couple this morning in our 8:30 service who's planning a wedding, and the wedding's going to be for June of next year. And you guys might remember this, the wedding planning, right? And you put in all of the effort. You get the lists of the guests ready. You make sure all the food is good. You're going to line up those who are going to do the hair, and you get the bridal dress. And you plan for about 90% of the wedding. And those of you who plan weddings know as well as I do, you never know what's going to happen on that wedding day. And it's the last 10% of a wedding that you just need to trust that the bride's going to look beautiful, that the groom's going to show up, and that the minister is going to be there to make everything concrete and solidify the vows, because at the end of the day, with all the planning that you do for a wedding, it's that last 10% that really makes a difference. Or you know as well as I, you can plan for that big project at work, or you can plan for things to go a certain way, or you can pray for the health and security of your family, but you know when you get to the rest of that 10%, that last 10% of uncertainty, that last 10% where you actually have to take that step or become vulnerable or step out in faith, you know that everything that you build around you falls away, the strength that you have, the know-how that you have goes to the wayside, and there you live in the midst, not of your strength, but out of God's weakness, which is made perfect in the midst of your vulnerability. And it's when the walls come down and you are there for all to see and you're most vulnerable that we're able to give God everything and all of who we are, because it's at that point that we realize that at the end of the day, we have nothing to lose, but everything to give. You know, even in ministry, come week after week on Wednesday morning, those of you who volunteer on Wednesday night, it's Wednesday, it's the middle of the week. If you're like me, you're tired, you're exhausted. Monday's hard, Tuesday, Wednesday, and there you are, exhausted and fragile and vulnerable, and you have to go to church and give all of who you are to serve those who are less fortunate than you. Or you have to go that extra mile in order to meet the needs of those around you. Or you feel like you've poured out your whole life into helping someone in need, maybe a family member, maybe you're a caregiver, and you're pouring out all of who you are, and it's at the end of your rope when you're most broken, most vulnerable, where God says, now you're to give out of your weakness, out of your scarcity. It's that last 10% that God calls you to step out in faith. And there you find, when you step out in that place of scarcity and vulnerability, and the charade of your life falls away, you discover that Jesus has been there all along, waiting for you to get there. See, Jesus was in the temple, people watching, and lo and behold, he was watching you. And he saw you coming in your place of honor, in your know-how, in your knowledge, in your talents and gifts and strengths. And he's waiting there, and he huddles around with his disciples and says, keep an eye on that one. Because as soon as one stone is turned off of another, as soon as one stone cannot stand on another, you'll see. And there in the midst of that brokenness, when we reach deeper in our lives, in the thin places of our lives, do we give those thin coins of all of who we are. This happens in church. It's a spiritual lesson, not just for projects and for weddings and for the ministries that we participate in or the willingness to pour out our lives. It also happens in church. I can tell you right now, we're coming up on budget time in a few months. And lo and behold, we'll continue to cut our budget 10% every year in order to save some costs. But I can guarantee you, it doesn't matter, no matter how much we cut, we're still going to be behind 10%. You cut 10%, you think you're going to break even? No, you're behind 10%. You do it the next year, you cut 10%, you're behind 10%. Why? Because 90% of what we give is out of our abundance. It's that last 10%. It's a spiritual law where we have to give out of our scarcity, where we have to dig deeper into the thin places of our lives in order to give, not out of our abundance and our generosity, but out of our scarcity. It's a spiritual law. That's why we always cut the budget. We're always 10% short. The last 10% is a call to go out in faith, just like everything else in our life. Works for money as well as the projects. Today, Christine and I have come with good friends of ours, Brian and Tiffany Hilburn. They're good friends, and actually many of you who were here last week heard the word preached by Quincy. They attend Quincy's church. And a very quick story of how they came into our life or back into our life. Christina has known Brian Hilburn from the public schools in Atlanta for nearly a decade, even before he met Tiffany. And the Hilburns started to go to Quincy's church, which also meant my old church. And there we were going to church, and the Hilburns were there. And Christina said, "What are you doing here?" And Brian said, "What are you doing here?" Lo and behold, they're going to Quincy's church, and they have education in common. So when Brian and Christine get together, they talk education. I don't understand a word. Tiffany and I usually just go and play with the kids. But for the last few years, they have had a vision, because they're both educators. Tiffany works as well. She's an educator. They have both had a vision to start a school for at-risk youth and boys specifically, knowing that in their community, in communities of color, nearly 3/4 of boys do not have fathers, nor a father figure. And as they have worked with Christina in the toughest schools in Atlanta, they know that you have to go an extra mile in order to help young boys and communities of color to get ahead. And so God gave them a vision to start a school for boys in particular. But it required faith. It meant that they had to look at their lives with the benefits and the health insurance and a steady paycheck of working in the school in order to make that vision a reality, to step out from that comfort zone and out of their strengths as educators in order to basically trust in God that the vision that they have was a God-given vision. And finally, several years ago, they left behind a steady paycheck in order to fulfill their vision. They couldn't ignore or deny God's call anymore. And 90% of all of who they were went into that because they're educators, they know what they're doing, they know about administration. But it was that last 10% of actually stepping out in faith and trusting that God would bring the resources for them to have a school. Required great courage and strength. And now they have a school filled with 20 boys, which doesn't seem like a lot. You may say, well, 20 boys. You have to understand that they were working in classrooms where if you can save the life of one boy, it made a difference in that community. 20 boys in which they have finally gotten to a place where they're receiving grants and they're able to fund both of them full-time at the school along with 2 other teachers at the school. But it only came at a point where they did everything that they were called to do, but then had to step out into that last 10% and give all of who they are out of the scarcity and the vulnerability that God allowed them to be blessed with that vision. To serve those 20 boys in that class. And to be blessed along the way, to be a blessing to us. It's such an amazing story to see how the spiritual law works. That as the Hilburns surrounded themselves and made plans, that when you step out in the midst of that trust and that faith, and walk into the midst of the brokenness that they saw in their community, that they found not only the vision to do that, but God's presence to make it happen. And praise God for that. I think we need to spend time with Jesus today, but he's in the temple, people watching. And if you're hesitant as I am, I'm not surprised. But I guarantee you that if you spend time with Jesus today and you crouch beside him, he'll grab you by the scruff of the neck and pull you in and say, look, disciple, look. Don't be fooled by the elegance around you. Don't be fooled by those edifices that we fortify, those walls that we reinforce with our self-assurance. I want you to spot the vulnerability and brokenness. That not only might you give out of your generosity and your abundance, but you might also give all of who you are out of your scarcity as well. For in the midst of the broken places and the thin places, we will see God at work. And we will see the measure of true faith of those who trust in God. Let's spend some time with Jesus today. And if you're hesitant, you're in good company. Amen.